Hey everyone, it is Hunter Fireflower, and in today's video, I will be giving you a review of the new book titled Queen's Peril by E.K. Johnston. So this is a fairly new book, and this is the prequel to Queen's Shadow by the same author. So in Queen's Shadow, I have a whole video on that if you don't know anything about that book, but that book basically tells us about how Padme went from becoming queen to senator and how she was going about joining the Senate and trying to get into committees and trying to just become like a political presence on Coruscant. This book is about Padme's reign as queen and how it goes into episode 1. This novel is great if you're interested in episode 1 regarding Naboo. It tells us what the people were doing on Naboo during the Trade Federation occupation and how the Trade Federation actually came to Naboo in the first place and why they're there. And it tells us a little bit of the backstory between how Darth Sidious is involved in this whole Naboo Trade Federation plot. So it was actually kind of interesting to read. Unlike in Queen's Shadow, where it kind of felt like more of a diary, this book actually has a plot and it shows direction. So I would say out of the two Padme books by the same author, I would definitely say that Queen's Peril is a lot more interesting than Queen's Shadow. That's just my personal opinion though. Probably because Queen's Shadow, the book about her being a senator, was just kind of mundane and there was no real plot or purpose to the novel. Meanwhile, I feel like this book actually is something I would recommend to read. One thing to mention though, this novel is definitely meant for a younger audience, specifically younger girls. There's a lot of scenes regarding like female hygiene and just like feminine products and stuff like that, which kind of threw me off because I've never really read a lot of young adult novels, especially those aimed towards girls. So I kind of felt like some of these scenes are just not necessary or needed, but I can see why she kind of put them in because she was trying to appeal to a younger audience of girls going through this whole thing to try and relate to Padme more is what I'm guessing, but for my personal opinion, I thought it was not needed at all. One thing I did really like about this novel was that it goes between a lot of different characters. Padme and the handmaidens are the main focus, but it will go through Darth Sidious as Darth Sidious and also as Senator. It will also go to Chancellor Valorum, Qui Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan, Darth Maul, Anakin Skywalker. Basically, everybody that's important in episode 1 gets a mention in this book, and sometimes it will just be like maybe like half a page, or sometimes it'll be a paragraph, but it was kind of nice to have like these little details. And one thing that I actually thought was totally out of the blue was there's a scene with Mace Windu and Yoda talking about Darth Sidious and Darth Maul, and they're just talking about how there's a darkness growing, and I really liked that scene in particular because it just kind of reminded me of more like episode 2 and 3 when they're like, there's something dark but we can't sense it, and it was just thrown in this book, so that was a really nice touch. In addition, there were a few parts in here that were a little confusing for me to read, and I think it just goes back to like it being a young adult novel because there was drama between the handmaidens, and for me, it didn't really make that much sense of what was going on because Sabe, who is one of the handmaidens, was trying to get with this girl, and Padme basically ruined Sabe's chances of getting with this girl, and for some reason Sabe is just like, don't worry, it's fine. So I don't know, there's a few scenes like that where something will happen to a character and then they'll respond, and their response and how they react doesn't really make that much sense because I feel like if the character was real, they would probably act a lot different than the way they are in the novel. One thing I did really like about this novel, though, is that it ties into episode 1, and it actually goes to the end of episode 1. I would say, like, when it started going into the episode 1, it kind of started losing its plot, and it just kind of relied on the movie to tell you the story, which makes sense because why would this book tell me the entire story of the movie? Because this book would be incredibly long if it had to do that. But it was a little fast-paced towards the end of the book. I would say it was the last 5 or 6 chapters, which were all about episode 1. And it was a lot more fast-paced, and it just had a bunch of like mini cutscenes. So that was the only thing that kind of threw me off in like the writing aspect of it, because the rest of the novel just is like a regular novel where like you'll have 5 pages about, or I shouldn't say 5, but you'll have a bunch of pages about one character's story and how they're progressing, and then it might cut to a different character for a page. But towards the end of the book, once it got into episode 1, it was just like paragraph about this scene and then another paragraph about this scene, and it was kind of a little bit strange to read like that since the entire novel was read just like a typical novel. They were kind of more like little short stories at the end once we got into episode 1. In addition, I would also recommend this book if you're into Naboo at all and you want to learn more about the culture of Naboo and the people, how students go through Naboo education and how the arts are actually handled. There's a little bit about politics as well in here, talking about senators and Chancellor Valorum and dealing with neighboring planets in the Naboo sector. So it does go into a little bit about that, but a lot of this novel talks about how students go through their training through the arts and what they do in this training and how they are selected and how it's a very strenuous time. Naboo takes their art serious, and it kind of reminds me of like the equivalent of the SATs in real life. And you can't become the top musician or the top sculptor or whatever. You're kind of seen as a loser. So it's kind of an interesting take on real life where we take math and science and all of those types of things to be very serious, but then on Naboo it's the complete opposite and has everything to do with like writing, literature, arts, and everything in between. So I just want to give a quick recap. I'm not going to be doing a full summary in this video, but I will be doing that in a separate video. So if you actually want the full story and what actually happens in this story, I will be putting a link in the description and I'll literally give you the entire summary. So if you don't want to read this book, you can just watch my video. But overall, I would say this book is definitely worth a read if you're into Naboo and Padme. I would definitely say it's not like the best book out of the Star Wars, but it's definitely way better than Queen's Shadow. I thought this had a lot more to it. It was not really a filler book. It actually had purpose, and it told you about how Naboo was going through the Trade Federation occupation and how Padme was going through all of this and how she was actually dealing with the situation. So I definitely recommend this if you're into like episode 1 Trade Federation, Naboo, Padme. Definitely read this. If you're a young reader and you want to get into reading Star Wars novels, this is actually a good one because if you've seen episode 1, you'll understand what's going on in this novel. I would definitely say this novel is aimed towards young ladies. I feel like a young guy could read this, but they probably would not enjoy it as much as a woman would because it talks a lot about, like I said earlier, feminine products and like drama and romance and stuff like that. So I definitely think it's geared towards more of a female audience, but I feel like you could still appreciate the book even if you are a guy. But anyways, guys, that is it for this video. I will be uploading another video with the full summary of this novel, and I'll go through all the important details of what actually occurs in this novel, so you actually don't have to read it if you don't want to. But I will see you in the next one. Stay frosty.